everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jamie Lee and I'm a mixed media artist. Here on my channel I talk about mixed media art supplies and techniques. I do time-lapse painting videos. I like to talk about weird art stories that I find interesting and fun, and I hope you do too. If that sounds good to you, you could hit the subscribe button and ring the bell to be notified when I post new videos. And I will link a playlist up here of my weird art videos if you want to check those out also. Weird art videos include videos on haunted paintings, art theft, art and true crime, and more. Now let's talk about today's video, which would fall into the weird art category. When I was researching ideas for a new video, I typed, "Has a painting ever helped solve a crime?" into Google. And do you want to guess what came up? Well, obviously something came up or I wouldn't be making a video, right? Right. I came across an article on observer.com written by a man named Andrew Scott Cooper. The August 2014 article is titled, "Did an Artwork Solve a Decades-Old NYC Crime?" With that as my starting point, I looked into the information I found. I ordered a whole ass book off Amazon on the subject and did my best to come up with all the info I could on what turned out to be a complicated case. So let's start where Mr. Cooper did when he became involved with this case in the spring of 1998. According to the Observer article, Cooper had just arrived in San Francisco that spring and was looking for something to do, it seems like. He offered his research skills to a man named Jonathan D. Katz, an art scholar who was studying the works of Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. The two artists were big on the New York City art scene in the 1950s and were also, now we know, quietly having a relationship in the mid to late 1950s. As you might imagine, two well-known male artists having a relationship in the 1950s was a bit risky. According to Cooper's article, they would face discrimination and could actually be blacklisted or even arrested if they were found out. Jonathan D. Katz wanted to research whether their artworks had been used as a form of covert communication between the two men and possibly other secretly gay artists. One painting in particular stood out to Katz, a combine done by Rauschenberg in 1954 and 1955, called Collection. A combine, and I think I'm saying that correctly. I mean, to me it just means to combine something, so combine. Yeah, it should be right. A combine just referred to an artwork that was a combination of materials. A mixed media artwork, if you will. It was a colorful artwork that also included pieces of mirror, paint, wood, photos, newspaper clippings, and even cartoons. But it was the newspaper articles, mostly obscured by paint and ink, that most interested Cooper. As he studied the painting, it seemed to him that one article had certain importance. It was from a New York City newspaper and it was pasted right in the center of the painting. But it was hard to tell what it was referring to since most of it was covered up by other stuff. And here's the spot on that painting where that article was pasted. He was able to make out a date though. August 22nd, 1954. He wondered, was that date significant? What was happening in New York City in August of 1954? To find out, we'll have to take a little trip back in time, almost 70 years back in time, and meet four teenagers whose lives went completely off the rails in the summer of 1954. Teenagers who infamously became known as the Thrill Kill Gang, the Brooklyn Thrill Killers, or the Kill for Thrills Gang. There were three things that collided that summer to create the perfect storm of events that took place in New York City that year, 1954. The first was a brewing backlash against juvenile delinquency. It seemed that teenagers, mostly teenage boys, were up to no good, and adults were sick of it. It wasn't just your run-of-the-mill teenage stuff like defacing property, skipping school, or smoking. The rash of delinquency that was making press included assaults, harassment, roving gangs committing crimes, and even murder. New Yorkers were angry and fed up, and they wanted their local government and law enforcement to do something about it. The second was a relatively new problem: comic books. As the popularity of comic books grew, so did the awareness of what was actually in these comic books. Things like graphic violence and sex, poor treatment of women, offensive racial stereotypes, and more. It hadn't gone unnoticed that boys, particularly teenage boys, tended to like comic books. And suddenly, juvenile delinquency was on the rise, and officials and parents were looking for something to blame. Television and movies got a fair amount of criticism, as per usual, but television relied on advertisers, so they didn't want to air anything too controversial and risk losing those advertising dollars. And the movie industry had its own set of regulations. So comic books were a great fall guy, especially since people were catching wind of a new trend in comic books: the horror comic. If regular comics were bad, then horror comics were bordering on perversion, according to a large sect of the population desperately trying to rein in young people looking for thrills and independence. So you may be wondering, well, that's interesting and all, but what does this have to do with that Rauschenberg painting and that guy Andrew Cooper and that thrill kill gang you mentioned? I'm glad you asked, because now we arrive at number 3. 4 teenage boys who either stirred the pot into a frenzy or became the fall guys of a public mob hell-bent on reining in out-of-control teenagers, depending on who you ask. Meet Jack Kozlow, 18, Mel Mittman, 17, Bobby Trachtenberg, 15, and Jerome Jerry Lieberman, 17. Now, were these hoodlums from the streets? Kids from torn-apart homes? Bad seeds from bad families? If you look at a few of those names, you might see something interesting. Yep, these 4 boys were from middle-class Jewish families. They went to good schools. They had hobbies. Their families, friends, and neighbors even described most of them as being good kids, excepting one, Jack Kozlow, who, it seemed, dealt with lifelong demons, despite his reputable family. That's why what they were accused of doing in the summer of 1954 was such a shock when it was reported in newspapers and other media. People thought they had a good idea of what juvenile delinquency was, and this wasn't it, sis. All of the boys lived in New York City's Jewish Williamsburg neighborhood, a community of over 25,000 upwardly mobile Jewish immigrant families. So let's talk about these 4 boys, the main characters in this saga. The first is Jerry Lieberman. Jerry lived in an air-conditioned 6-room apartment, and his family owned a TV and radio shop. He was accomplished at playing the piano and was interested in science. He studied Hebrew, liked playing baseball in the streets, was well liked, and was generally considered a good kid. The only clue something was up in the summer of 1954 was that he had begun to act moody and secretive, something his father noticed and was worried about. Then we have Bobby Trachtenberg. He lived in the 3rd floor apartment of a 3-story building owned by his grandfather. He and Jerry had attended the same religious elementary school and were good friends. He had an IQ of 135 and wanted to be an engineer. He was a Boy Scout, loved books, and was described as polite and studious. Then we have Mel Mittman. He worked out at the YMHA, the Young Man's Hebrew Association, where he was a locker room custodian, a position of trust. At just 17, he was muscular, weighed 220 pounds, and was said to be able to lift 170 pounds over his head. He lived in a brownstone with his parents and his grandparents. His father worked in the garment district, and his grandparents owned a grocery store. He played piano, banjo, and several other instruments. But he began a downward spiral in high school. He smoked, he failed 3 subjects, and he started skipping school. Bad friends were blamed, but according to many, it was just one bad friend, Jack Kozlow. So who was Jack Kozlow? He was a 6-foot-tall redhead, nicknamed Red, who was extremely smart, but also described as extremely mean. His IQ was 138, and he took gifted classes in school, but he didn't fit in. He was picked on by bullies early on, and when he was 13, he fought back, and soon he was the one that was starting fights. He became obsessed with and admired Adolf Hitler. He taught himself German when he was 12 years old. Then he read Mein Kampf, and also Nietzsche and Kant. Unfortunately, even though he was bright, he didn't care about school and was manipulative and scheming, breezing through school and graduating at age 15 by blackmailing and playing the teachers and staff and paying students to mark him in attendance. He did not fare so well at New York University, which he attended after graduating high school, where his scams didn't fly, and he was referred to a psychiatrist for his views on Nazism, and the psychiatrist ended up suspecting that he might be schizophrenic. He dropped out of university university in his second year and began a series of jobs that he found hard to hold down. One thing he did stick to, his belief that he could do his part to rid the city of vagrants and homeless alcoholic bums. He knew the police commissioner was dealing with an increased homeless population, and he saw himself as some sort of superhero who could clear the riffraff from the streets. Those are the 4 boys in this story. Now, what did these boys actually do? Well, let's look at the official version, the chain of events that was reported in their murder trial. This is also the version of events that appears in most reports and articles that I pulled up while looking into this crime. The so-called gang of boys would get together and, in a misguided delusion of superhero-ness, they would seek out and torture Brooklyn's homeless population. They attacked random homeless men, allegedly, set a homeless man on fire after dousing him with gasoline, and beat a homeless man named Reingold Ulrichsen to death while he slept on a park bench. Then one night, August 16th, 1954, the gang happened upon a factory worker named Willard Menter, a 34-year-old black man they found sleeping on a park bench. They burned his feet with cigarettes to wake him, kicked him repeatedly, then dragged his body to the end of South 5th Street, beat him some more, and then threw him in the river. Menter's lifeless body was pulled out of the river a few days later. The 4 were quickly arrested, charged, and put on trial. The crimes, the trial, and the action of the boys spread like media wildfire. Not only were the crimes reported in local New York City newspapers, but also reported on frequently in national news media. The media, law enforcement, and government officials were the ones who set in motion the idea that they were a gang, gave them the thrill-kill description since they never robbed anybody, so they must be killing and doing crime just for the thrill of it. And in fact, in some of the confessions given to law enforcement officers, they even said as much. They were bored, they wanted something to do, and they also put forth a very specific description of the boys that the public could really latch onto. In short, they were neo-Nazi, Hitler-loving, possibly homosexual teenage juvenile delinquents. The trial of the 4 boys was a media sensation, with Kozlow and Mittman being found guilty of first-degree murder, Lieberman sent to juvie, and Trachtenberg, the youngest, was acquitted. And that's the end, right? The juvenile delinquents were captured. Their reign of terror was brought to a swift halt. Justice was served. Not exactly. To get to the real story, let's go back to that collection painting that Andrew Scott Cooper was studying. He worked on researching it from the spring to the fall of 1998, and then moved on to other things. He hadn't found any secret communication between lovers like Katz was expecting, but he did find those newspaper articles and that mysterious date that you could see through the paint and ink. Several years later, it still entered his thoughts, and on the path to becoming an art historian, thought it might be a good project to give himself. So he once again went back to the Rauschenberg painting, a poster-sized reproduction, and set about decoding what the art was trying to say to him. He soon discovered that the newspaper clipping in the center of the painting was from the front page of the New York Herald Tribune on August 20, 1954, and there was an article titled, "Slain Man Taken from River, Forced to View Victim, Thrill Killers Break." And here's a short excerpt from that article. Brooklyn's 4 teenage killers, who murdered and tortured for fun, flinched yesterday when they were confronted with the body of one of their 2 known murder victims. 3 of the hoodlums cried out in terror when they viewed the bruised face of the man they had beat up and pushed into the East River last Monday night. Cooper decided to go straight to the sources to see if this incredibly biased sounding reporting was true. He asked New York state and city agencies to let him see all of the official records from the case. Cooper claims that he found some very interesting evidence that shows the murders the boys had been accused of, Menter and Ulrichsen, weren't actually murders. The New York City office of the Chief Medical Examiner spokesperson, Ellen Borakov, told Cooper that the records in her possession were strange because, number 1, they didn't match the official police version, and 2, Menter's death certificate had been changed. Someone, at some point, had put a white piece of tape over his cause of death. In his autopsy report, his cause of death was listed as drowning following an alleged assault. However, there was no physical indication of an assault. no head wounds, no injuries to his hands indicating that he tried to defend himself, and no burn injuries on the bottoms of his feet. The last thing Cooper did was to track down Mel Mittman, now 67. Of course, this was back around 2014 when the article was written. And Mel agreed to an interview with Cooper where he gave his version of events. According to Mittman, he and the 3 other boys were set up, essentially, by law enforcement and government officials. He and Kozlow did roam the streets of New York City that summer, and they were looking for homeless people to beat up and get off the streets. So there was no sugarcoating there. They were doing wrong things. But Kozlow, according to Mittman, saw himself as some sort of crime-fighting hero, determined to clean the streets of homeless, alcoholic, often gay men who took up residence at the Brooklyn waterfront. It was becoming a real problem that summer because of the influx of people that were setting up camp down at the waterfront. Kozlow even saw himself as a helper to law enforcement, someone who was working together with the police to end the crime wave that was sweeping New York City. Mittman says the death of Ulrichsen was accidental. They got into a scuffle and the man fell and hit his head on the curb, leaving him with a head injury which led to his eventual death. As for Willie Menter, Mittman says Kozlow beat him up at the waterfront while Mittman looked on. Jerry and Bobby had roamed the city with Kozlow and Mittman earlier that evening, but according to Mittman, they were not there when the incident with Menter happened. So rather than a gang of bloodthirsty teenage killers, they were really just some bored kids with a misplaced sense of duty and too much anger, according to Mittman. Now, Mittman says that once in police custody, they were held without food, water, or sleep, threatened with bodily harm, accused of numerous other unrelated crimes, and constantly told that the other boys were turning on them, so they better confess now. Mittman even went so far as to say that Assistant District Attorney Louis Cohen just told his stenographer to erase parts of what Mittman said that Cohen didn't like or that didn't fit with the story that he wanted to put out there. Now, after interviewing Mittman and then going back to look at the painting collection, Cooper drew a conclusion. The boys, while they had done some criminal deeds, were mostly set up by officials looking for some way to end the hysteria over juvenile delinquency, and they were berated into confessing and put on trial and convicted in an unfair atmosphere where the public had been whipped into a frenzy by media and law enforcement officials. Cooper was convinced that Rauschenberg had placed that newspaper clipping there on purpose to point the viewer to the conclusion that a plot had been covered up, just like the article itself had been covered up by paint and ink. It's a great story, isn't it? This painting, almost 70 years after the events took place, solved the murders and exposed a web of conspiracy and cover-up that left 4 teenage boys having to pick up the pieces of their lives for years after. It's a great story, but I'm not totally buying it either. You see, there's another version of events detailed in the book The Brooklyn Thrill Kill Gang and the Great Comic Book Scare of the 1950s. It's an incredibly detailed account of what happened, backed up by 38 pages of cited notes. It details the atmosphere in the city in 1954, the biographies of the boys' lives, the detailed account of the night in question, August 16th, 1954, the police interviews, the legal circus that took place, how comic books entered the picture and what that meant for the trial, and the whole aftermath of everything. After reading the Observer.com article and the book, do I think the case was solved by the Rauschenberg painting? In a word, no. There's too many discrepancies for me. First, let's start with the date. In the painting collection by Rauschenberg, there's a newspaper with the date August 20th, 1954. But the crime that we're talking about happened on the night of August 16th, 1954. Of course, the events of that night and the events that happened after were widely reported in the media. But Cooper wanted that particular news article to have particular meaning in the painting. In fact, it seems like what he wanted is for that particular newspaper article to point the viewer to a way to solve the crime that was detailed in that clipping. But the date seems kind of random. The event happened on August 16th. Also, in the article Cooper wrote for The Observer, he originally says the date in the news clipping is August 22nd, 1954. And that he went back to see what was happening around that time and found a news clipping from the New York Times dated August 20th, which clued him into what was happening around that time frame. But then at the end of the article, he says he matched the clip from the painting to a New York Herald Tribune article from August 20th, not August 22nd. So there seems to be a little confusion around the date of the article in the painting, and if it's supposed to have that much significance to direct a viewer to literally solve a crime from 70 years ago, there shouldn't be that much wondering about dates and having to go back and find what's going on somewhere around there. I mean, somebody could have lost their cat, and that was what it was pointing it to. I don't know, just saying. Then there's the narrative surrounding the victims in these incidents, Willie Menter and Reinhold Ulrichsen. According to most articles that were reported on this incident, both were homeless men sleeping on park benches when they were attacked and killed. That's not true. Peter Reinhold Ulrichsen was actually part owner of a steeplejack company and was walking out of a bar at the end of South 5th Street when he encountered Mittman and Kozlow. He wore old clothes when he was working, so he kind of looked like a vagrant, and he had also been drinking in the bar, so he was drunk. And he was friends with a homeless man named Pinky, and they would get together and drink and hang out sometimes. So the boys mistook him for a homeless vagrant, when actually he wasn't. He died because he stepped in while the boys were harassing another man, another homeless person, and he stuck up for this guy and kind of jumped in to the fray, and Mittman punched him, and he crumpled to the sidewalk and fatally hit his head on the gutter. Menter, Willie Menter, was on the streets because he was a drunk. He liked to drink and borrow advances from his employer, but he was constantly getting laid off and then being rehired. So he was never in steady employment, and he was constantly borrowing the money he might be getting from working and blowing it on drink. On top of that, he would rather do this cycle than go home to his wife and children. His wife had become so fed up with what he was doing that she kicked him out. And he was staying at his brother's house, but he was sleeping off his drink on a park bench when the boys found him. He was only 34 years old, although other things I've seen says he was 31, so somewhere in his early 30s. Rather than the accepted account that was pushed about the boys dragging him to the riverfront, beating him and throwing him in the river, they actually walked him down a well-lit street in front of many open businesses for several blocks before arriving at the riverfront, which is then where Mittman had told Cooper that Kozlow beat him up, and then he ended up in the river, not that they threw him in the river. They thought he was jumping in the water to just kind of escape and swim away, but he did not swim away. He drowned instead. It seems as though in Cooper's article he's aiming for the narrative that these boys were mishandled by law enforcement. They were just the fall guys for this police cover-up. In the coverage of the police interrogations in the trial, in the book, it goes into great detail about the various lawyers representing each boy, their arguments, how the trial spun out of control thanks in large part to a hidden agenda, a war against comic books that was being waged in the city at that very moment. One expert who talked to Kozlow before the trial discovered that he was a fan of horror comics, and in particular the sexually sadistic Nights of Horror comic series, a limited edition comic that was only sold in a select few places in New York and only to adults. There may have been some strong-arm police tactics in the interrogations of each boy, but any setup or plan to take down the Thrill Kill gang in a bid to show authorities were on top of ending juvenile delinquency was far surpassed by the powers that be, seizing the opportunity to put comic books on trial along with the four boys. A huge part of the case that was barely mentioned in Cooper's article, especially once they found out that Kozlow claimed to own the Nights of Horror comic series. The larger conversation became about how these horror comic books had taken a group of decent Jewish boys and turned them into depraved, possibly homosexual killers. Yep, being gay was also thrown into the mix, because although it seemed as though Jack Kozlow targeted gay, homeless, vagrant men, it was widely reported that although Jack had briefly dated a girl, he had had many flings in the past with other boys and older men. There is much more in-depth coverage in the book about the trial and the outcome and how it tied comic books and juvenile delinquency together, but for the purposes of this video, let's just say that although not right away, the outcome of the sensationalized trial did end up punishing targeting Mittman and Kozlow the most, although it was widely believed at the time, thanks to Mittman's lawyer, Fred Morit, that the charges were trumped up and the media attention prevented a fair trial. So back in the time where all of this was happening, people understood that the charges were probably being trumped up to make these boys pay for the sins of the whole city, basically. And there was a lot of discussion around the time of the trial about the boys actually getting a fair trial, because it really seemed like there was no way for them to get a fair jury, a fair trial. So they knew all of that at the time. It wasn't like they covered it up and nobody knew. It was just a perfect storm of all kinds of things that captured everyone's attention. The use of the name Hitler in regards to the boys. Comic books, which, you know, adults saw as an enemy. Of course, the comic book industry saw as, you know, the government and government officials trying to take them down. So there was a huge pot full of all kinds of stuff happening. And on top of that, the juvenile delinquency problem in New York City at the time. These 4 boys represented the Jewish community, who they didn't want anything to do with everything that was going on. They didn't want these boys to represent them and their community. So how did everything end? Well, eventually in 1958, Mittman and Kozlow finally won their appeal, because they had originally been sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, and they narrowly escaped getting the death penalty, actually. And the reason why their appeal was granted was because originally the first-degree murder convictions hinged on the belief that they had kidnapped Willie Menter, and kidnapping was an actual charge in their trial. And it was not proved that Willie Menter was kidnapped, because he walked with them under his own power and was not under the threat of a weapon. So the charge of kidnapping could not be proved. Murder in the first degree due to kidnapping was something they couldn't convict them of. So eventually in the appeal, both boys pleaded guilty to manslaughter in the first degree, which carried a sentence of 10 to 20 years. All 4 boys had faced either a life sentence or the death penalty at the very beginning of the trial. But at the end of the process, Bobby spent his time in reform school, while Jerry, after his acquittal, ended up at the University of Arizona, where he graduated with honors and planned to attend law school. So this entire thing came about because I typed a question into Google, has a painting ever solved a crime? And what came up was a really interesting time in history that I knew nothing about. I learned a great deal, but do I think that the painting collection by Robert Rauschenberg solved this crime? No. I don't believe that the painting and the crime went together that way. It's possible that Rauschenberg, because he was in New York at the time and because the coverage was, you know, so widespread, that he specifically put that information in his painting for a reason. I don't think it was to point a future viewer to look back at the crime and try to solve it, because in my opinion, based on what I've researched, the crime was already solved. Yes, you know, eventually they pretty much did decide that the gentleman who died, Menter and Ulrichson, pretty much did die accidentally. It was because of what Kozlow and Mittman did, but they didn't set out intending to kill these men purposefully. So to say that the painting solved this crime, that's a stretch. The crime was already solved. They know that these boys were responsible for what happened to the men. It was just a matter of what did they do specifically to cause that. You know, on top of that, there was the knowledge that although they weren't a gang of bloodthirsty killers or juvenile delinquents roaming around the city causing chaos and anarchy, they were roaming around the city beating up people, homeless men. They were causing chaos. Did it turn into a media circus? Was it unfair that they couldn't get a fair trial because of how much publicity the case got? Yeah, that's absolutely true. But in the end, after they appealed, pretty much it worked out as best it could, I guess. And, you know, they were trying to convict them of what they actually had done in the end. Did they strong arm them? Did they interrogate them in order to intimidate them and scare them into talking? Of course they probably did. I mean, this was back in the 1950s. They didn't care. Maybe they wanted to paint their own narrative and they wanted the boys to fall in line. Who knows? That's where I'm going to end this video on the Thrill Kill gang and the events of August of 1954. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope that you learned something. I did, because I'd never heard of this case before that Google search, so it's kind of been lost in time. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. I would appreciate it if you would subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this one. Ring the bell to be notified when I upload a new video. I hope you're having a great day, and I will see you next time. Bye! I mean, I don't know. Collection. He was picked on by Burleys. Reinhard? Son of a biscuit. Yeah, cut that part. But it was the newspaper articles. I am total, oh my god, am I rambling? I am rambling so much, I need to cut probably most of that out. I need to quit rambling. I hope I didn't say like so and what's that other word I use? Whatever it is.